Hi, beautiful friends. It's David Ault, and I want to welcome you to The Gathering. If you've come across this video, you have come across a series of stories. And these stories I am telling during the month of September in the year 2024. And why September? Well, that is the pivotal fundraising month for my nonprofit. It's called Kaleidoscope Child Foundation. And I thought it might be a fun way for me to tell you some of the things that you don't know about that happened in the 20-year history of the unfoldment and the development of this thing now that helps educate over 1,000 children annually across the world in some of the most impoverished territories, that has brought sanitation and hygiene and life skills and technology and all kinds of things that continue to become the main focus of my time on Earth. And so some of these stories, I think you might find your own overlaying of inspiration in them. So this one I'm calling The Bond. The Bond. And so it is 2016. I'm going to guess most likely in January, because January was always the main month that we would travel to Cambodia. Cambodia was the first place that we began. And by 2016, we had two campuses. We like to call them campuses. And this was the main campus in the city of Siem Reap. And I was standing on a rooftop and I was overlooking the sewing building and the courtyard and the little classroom area and the two outdoor pavilions that served as classrooms. And it was sort of a break in between classes. And you could see all the little movement and the scurrying and the noise of all of the children. And they were playing and laughing and talking. And there was much, much commotion going on, almost like looking down at a little sea of ants. And I remember having this feeling going, wow, how did this come to be? And it was a moment of gratitude and reflection. And it was also a moment that a new idea rushed in. And it was perhaps there are enough systems in place that you could replicate this somewhere. In other words, expansion. How could you take the intention of bringing education like you've done, like so many have contributed in helping birth this thing in Cambodia, perhaps somewhere else? And it wasn't expansion or growth just for expansion's sake. It was the genuine sort of call inside about there are a lot of children in this world, a lot of children perhaps in more difficult circumstances than the children down below. How might you be a part of the solution? And immediately when that came to mind, I thought, oh gosh, are we ready for this? And I realized that in that moment, there were enough systems in place that perhaps we could do something small. We could like open a little door somewhere and begin to bring our devotion and our intention of global education somewhere else on the planet. And that somewhere else ended up being India. And later on in that same year, I went to India with a laundry list of things that I was looking for if this was meant to be or if it could be possible. At the top of the list was the person. The person is the one who would most likely be an administrator, your voice, your eyes, your ears, your action on the ground. When, of course, we live in the United States and we can't be there full time. Who would that person be? Because without them, nothing moves forward. And I realized through a bunch of hardships and mistakes that you can't take that person lightly. Um, that requires some intuition and some trust and some um, hits and misses. And so off I went to India with this list with where would that person be? And I just paid attention and went to many places. And the last place that I went to is called Bodh Gaya. And perhaps you're familiar with Bodh Gaya because it is a very famous city in human history. It is the birthplace of Buddhism. And you might be thinking, well, India is a Hindu country and the birthplace of Buddhism. Well, at one time in human history, it wasn't all Hindu. It was where Siddhartha, or who later became known as the Buddha, gained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya under a tree called the Bodhi tree. And it is there that the fourth generation of the Bodhi tree from a graph still uh, blossoms out over this majestic heritage site that is the Mecca of Buddhists around the world. Bodh Gaya is not a big city, nor is it a town. It's something in between, like a smallish city. And yet there are more than 20 monasteries, each monastery representing a Buddhist country. And in these monasteries, there are monks that have traveled from those countries. Sometimes those monks stay there for 3 months, for 6 months, sometimes for their entire life. And so in Bodh Gaya, you have the Indian people, the Hindus, and then you have the monks, and then you have many, many, many tourists, Buddhist tourists, who come to Bodh Gaya because that is, again, the Mecca. And so there's this beautiful kind of mix, this dance between Hindu tradition and then monks walking in the various colors of their saffron robes on the dirt roads of Bodh Gaya. And the level of poverty is still the same that you could imagine that exists throughout India. And this is where I landed. And we went in the month of August, which I do not advise you to go because of the level of heat and intensity of that heat, and coupled with humidity and sometimes some parts rainy seasons. And so it was quite something. And I was staying in an ashram, and I would get up in the middle of the night and take bucket baths. I would take a bucket and fill it with cold water and pour it over my head. And there was a high-speed fan in the ceiling, and I would keep my fingers crossed that the electricity would stay going enough so that I would stand under there with the cool drip water and try to cool off just to get through the night. That's how hot it was. And at one of these days in Bodh Gaya, after many attempts in other places and not really becoming successful in what I was looking for, I wandered from my room down to the lobby where there was a lobby and there was a little desk and there was a young man sitting there. And I went to the lobby because if you squeezed into the corner, you might be able to get Wi-Fi reception on your phone. And I was there for a purpose. And I'm huddled in this corner, and here's this young man. And we said hello. And he asked me who I was and what I was doing. And I shared a little bit. And the conversation turned to education. And I learned all about him. I learned that he was the oldest son in the family, a large family. Um, Traditionally, in the Indian family structure, there's a lot of pressure on that older son. These people are all lower caste. And so he had struggled and worked to provide his own education. He had traveled to Calcutta and had become a part of some big, almost like a warehouse of workers for some tech company or computer company, where basically you're kind of sleeping on a cot and working 16 hours a day, making nothing, but you're also able to get a little bit of education through that process. And it was a very lonely, isolating process for him, but he was able to not only um, make a little bit of money and get a degree, but it was something that was opening himself up to developing new skills that he wasn't going to learn if he had stayed in Bodh Gaya. And he had gone through that adventure. He was back in Bodh Gaya. He was still looking for what else there was to do. And I talked to him about his education and about that process. And something inside of me goes, okay, perhaps this might be possible. And I told him to send me all of his information, his documentation, his degrees, the diplomas, and the coursework, and his identification, which he did promptly. In fact, because that was my last stop, I was back in the United States days after that, and this correspondence by email began. And he would send me everything that I requested of him. And I felt like perhaps maybe this might be the way that we could explore this. And so we came up with the idea, the board, of giving a little bit of seed money. What if we give some seed money and we say, here's what we want? We want to provide schooling for impoverished children who are outside of the system, those who are overlooked, children that this young man, his name is Nandu, knew very well because he lived in a slum. He was from a slum. He knew the ins and outs of Bodh Gaya and the needs. And he said, I will do you right. And I will fast forward a year. Remember, this is just a little bit of seed money. In a year, Nandu not only managed to acquire children for schools, he had rented a lopsided, crumbling building with a couple of rooms in it in the slums in Bodh Gaya, where his family was from, and then also negotiated to get a cow barn in a slum called Lakhanpur, about 45 kilometers away. So, not just one little thing, he had two outlets of children, and he had managed to get teachers. And I'm not talking just any teachers, I'm talking really skilled, smart teachers. And when we went back a year later, um, all that I can say is you and I have probably used the expression mind blown oftentimes. And I will say, in that moment, there was a genuine, full, mind blown experience of what he was able to accomplish in that year. I could not comprehend it. I could not comprehend how these children had come from practically complete illiteracy to to the knowledge that they were expressing, to their ability to do a bit of reading and to do some basic math and even fractions. And so we went first to the little crumbling school in Bodh Gaya and saw the enthusiasm of what it was that was happening in these little two tiny rooms, all the way to this slum where nothing existed. It was a dirt road and it has a population of about 5,000 people. And it is the poorest of the poor. And in the floor of a cow barn, there were huddled close to 30 children with a teacher sitting on a plastic stool in the corner and creating magic in this room. And I'm sitting on the floor of this cow barn marveling, astonished, mind blown. And I had this little bit of ego pop in that said, wow, David, look at what you've done. And it was like a momentary gloating, uh, like puffed up with pride. And as soon as it sort of inflated itself in me, this pinprick came and went, and it was like, oh my God, what have you done? And all of a sudden, that puffed up inflation turned into horror because I realized that we had genuinely opened up a box, like a Pandora's box, of opportunity for the girls, the little girls that were in this cow barn, the little girls that were in the school back over in Bodh, and given them a pathway of learning, a pathway of knowledge, of instruction. And that as I looked around the environment, there would be nothing, no resource for them to be able to use that. Meaning, in rural territories in places like India, culturally in the Hindu culture, these young girls would grow up and very soon, as probably in their early teens to early 20s, they would be married off. They would stay within the family dynamic. They wouldn't be going off to a city like Delhi or Calcutta. That was usually reserved for the boys or certain people within the family, certainly not everybody because you can't afford it. And so the destiny, if you will, in these cultures is that they would remain there. They would be married. Then the girls would end up serving the parents in the family household of the husband's in-laws and family. That's just the way that it was. It certainly wasn't our business to disrupt that culture. But now here we are introducing something, expanding the brain, if you will, um, really taking sponges and tossing them into the seascape, and those sponges starting to absorb all of that water, all of that knowledge that was so hungrily there. Otherwise, I mean, you couldn't explain how fast they were learning in other traditions. Comparatively, if I were to take that to what we experience in Cambodia, it's like night and day. There's just like this element there of um, brilliance, genius. And I was horrified because it was like, this is yet another example of sort of Western carelessness where, oh, we'll just teach them how to do, and then not really seeing it through. And I was introduced in the nonprofit world a motto that is very true. And that motto is you can't care about some of it, you got to care about all of it. And suddenly, this wasn't just expanding classrooms. This was opening up something that was going to require Kaleidoscope Child Foundation to really sort of step back, take a breather, and go, are you ready for this? Because this isn't just opening a school. This is becoming involved in a long-standing relationship, a long-standing commitment that will see see these young women, particular these girls, um, to a place where there is possibility for their own autonomy through employment, and somehow couple that without disrupting culture. And all of a sudden, I became very overwhelmed and shared that with the others. And it was pretty evident to see that over the next year and over the next year, that the potential was so ripe, and the rapidity by which they were learning and expanding and hungry was going to really require some stretching. And we made a commitment to build a school, an actual school building in the slum of Lakhanpur where the cow barn was. And and so the process of that, of starting that, kept being delayed because of a physical illness of mine, a genetic heart condition. I thought I was going to have these heart surgeries that kept getting postponed due to blood clots and issues, and we couldn't postpone the the digging of the school any longer. We had kind of held people at bay around my condition, and so off we go in May. Myself and two other board members from Kaleidoscope, we traveled to India in May to break ground for this school. Again, May, India, hot. Wow, when are we going to learn? It was so hot. It was so hot. It felt even hotter than that August years before. And now we were part of a ceremony in the slum village of Lakhanpur, and there was a lot of excitement and anticipation there. And while we are breaking ground in Lakhanpur for this, we're also dividing our time into the crumbling building that we still have in Bodh Gaya and working with the students there. And it's around almost close to the last couple of days there. And it's the end of the day, and we have been working in the crumbling building in Bodh Gaya, super hot. And all of a sudden, I get this tremendous chest pain. And I panic a little bit because I don't know if it's heart related. I don't know what's going on. And the initial thought is, oh my God, don't make a scene. Please don't make a scene, David. Like find a hole somewhere and just sit on the floor. And there was no place that wasn't exposed by everybody. And so I'm huddled next to a file cabinet, and I got the attention of Nandu, and I said, I don't feel well. And I said, is there a way that I can leave without making or causing a distraction? And Nandu ended up having to sort of shoulder carry me out of the building. And luckily, his parents' place that I'd never seen, the family dwelling in the slum, was a mere little 7 minutes from that classroom. We just had to go down a couple of alleyways where I was brought into the home. I was laid on a bed, um, and it appeared as though I had had a heat stroke. And I'm feeling really, really a bit afraid because I don't know that it's a heat stroke. I think perhaps I'm having a heart attack or something. And there's a bunch of movement and a bunch of women talking I don't understand, and Nandu's communicating. They are plugging in an electric fan. They don't even have the fan plugged in, even in that heat, perhaps to save electricity, but they've plugged this fan in and directed the fan. And all of a sudden, I am helpless. I am lying on a bed in a slum in India, experiencing a heat stroke, and I'm looking up at a sea of faces of Indian women putting compresses, wet compresses over my head. They have called the local Ayurvedic woman, and she has come, and she's taking all kinds of things from like rock sugar and some seeds of some sort, and she's mashing them in her hand and force feeding them into my mouth. And I'm just laying there, and there is no resistance on my part because I don't have the energy to resist. I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm laying there, and I'm feeling a tremendous amount of love. Suddenly, the panic dissolves, and I'm just in full noticing of the sea of these faces of these women taking care of me. And while this is happening, Nandu's father walks in. Nandu's father, Munarik is a janitor at one of those Buddhist monasteries. Had been one for almost over 12 years. In fact, I believe he was the janitor at the Korean monastery. And he had come home from his day's work and noticed all of this. And he's talking excitedly to Nandu and motioning to me, and Nandu's explaining what's going on. And Munarik is talking to Nandu feverishly and very emphatically about something. And Nandu goes, now? You want me to tell him now? And he shakes his head. And so Nandu looks at me in this state while I'm lying on this bed with these cold compresses on my head. And he says to me, my father wants to give you a gift. And I was like, okay. And the gift ended up being a parcel of land, a parcel of land. I have to describe to you the the impoverished nature of lower caste people, families that live in slums, the way in which they must work so long and hard just to create any kind of or maintain any kind of sustainability. And there's a quote I often remember that said, sometimes those who give the most are the ones who have the least to spare. Sometimes those who give the most are the ones who have the least to spare. Munarik was giving me land, land that he had a deed to, land that back in the 90s he had won in a lottery that had been hosted by the government for poor laborers, for lower caste men. And this lottery was designed that whoever won it, perhaps they would be able to farm it or create a business, and that they would try to continue to do these land lotteries from time to time. And Munarik had won this lottery. It's now 2019, and he's been holding on to this probably for 25 years. At any time in those 25 years, he could have sold that parcel. They did not have the means to uproot themselves and to go over there and start again. And so he had just held on to this deed. Nandu told me that there had been many, many times where people had come and had wanted to develop it and purchase it from him. And for whatever reason, he had said no. He wanted, and now he wanted me to have that. He wanted Kaleidoscope to be the new owners of this land. And when I asked Nandu why would he do such a thing? He said, because you believed in his son, me. And when I think about that, um, obviously it humbled me a great deal. Obviously, it sort of aligned with the understanding that how are we going to provide for these young girls in the future? What would that look like? The land is still there. Um, it will take quite a bit in order to give birth to something. We envision a school and a work center for these girls after they graduate. Um, Perhaps there will be a cafe or a storefront for the village mothers to sell their own wares and their own creations in order to have their own autonomy as well. But that's a whole nother vision and a whole nother story. But Munarik looked at me and he just did this. And there was something in that look um, that I call it a bond. It was a bond just that could not be contained with you believed in my son, so I'm going to give you this. It was something much more infinite to me, like forgive me if it sounds corny, but like a karmic thing, like a bond, like, okay, now it's time. I felt that once before in Cambodia, years into being in Cambodia. There was a student, I mean, a teacher named Kim Zeke, who had really wanted me to come to his village. There was, and it was very far away. It was like an hour and a half by motorbike, and there would never been time in the schedule to do that. And one year I stayed longer, and I promised Kim Zeke that I would come to his village because what he was creating on the weekends was a school, like his own version. He was taking the money that he was making at our school as a teacher and he was putting it back into his community and he was teaching the locals there on the weekends and in like a again like just an open area, and he wanted me to see it. He felt a lot of pride, and so the day came for me to go see that, and his brother had shown up to give me a ride on this motorbike. And for an hour and a half through the dust and the roads of Cambodia, I arrive in this village, and I don't go to the school first. I go to their home, a home that is not even a home, had no roof, no water, no electricity. His mother, his father, his brother, Kim Zeke himself, they all lived there. And there was ways and means and survivals that I'm still to this day not sure. How did they get water? How did they sleep? How did they prevent themselves from, um, getting washed away in monsoon seasons and things like that? Everything was so rudimentary that I was amazed that this was his home, this was his environment. And his mother had cooked for me. She wanted to meet me, the the person who not only had given her son a job, and then his brother was now also going to work at the school, but was also paying for continuing education. Kaleidoscope paying for continuing education for Kim Z. And she wanted to express gratitude, and she cooked some mystery meat over an open fire, and I'm sitting there and I'm eating this and I'm watching her, and she's doing this to my shoulder and repeatedly bowing and namaste and thanking me in her language and over just fervently until it was time for Kim Zeke to take me away on the motorbike to where they had their school. The students were there, and it was a pretty good distance from where his family lived in this outdoor area. I'm at the school. And while I'm there, I couldn't have been there more than 2 hours working with the kids, really impressed at what Kim Zeke was doing, listening and engaging with them. His mother had walked from where we were all the way to this makeshift classroom carrying a very large coconut for me because she wanted to make sure that I had something to drink. Thankfully, the moment was not lost on me. And I looked at her and she looked at me. And it was this bond that somehow, some way, what we were all doing here was much bigger than me just observing a makeshift school. It's happened one other time with a young student in India in the Lakhanpur school, a young girl that after we had the ribbon cutting later in 2019 for the school, we managed to get this school built. I had walked out of the school and walked up the road of the slum because I was going to take a picture of it because it kind of sits at the end of the road. And this little girl had followed me. And when I turned around, I caught her because she had followed me and she was just beaming. And she's one of those brilliant students. In fact, she kind of stands out. And I looked at her and she looked at me beaming. And it wasn't so much thank you for building this school, it was more of a bond that kind of said, keep at it. And that little girl has kept me going because the light that was there that day after the school opened, the light feels as though it's fading a little bit as she matures, as she has to navigate certain oppressive acts that take place for young girls in these situations. And so it's these bonds that pop up every now and again. And I realize that this is so much bigger than just a hobby. As I was sharing some sadness with my partner last night, he said, it really is like having a child, David. He said, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's almost like having a special needs child. And those who have special needs child need support. No one can do that alone, and you need support. And I realized that over the years, the drive to take people to see these places has resulted in a few other people also birthing that same bond. And those people have stayed, and those people have devoted their lives and their work to keeping Kaleidoscope thriving. But the ratio of the number of people who have gone and witnessed and participated and been very moved by all of that, the bond still wasn't there. And I realized that not everybody has that. Everybody has their own version of their bonds and their work in the world. And sometimes I get lost in hoping that more people will have the same bond. And that's where I get caught. And that's where I get in the way. And that's where I get fearful. And that's where my hopes and my wishes sometimes get spun out of control. And I have to take a breath or something happens. And I am moved back to my humbling. And I have to look at Munarik's face, Nandu's father. I have to look at the mother in Cambodia with the coconut. And I have to look at that young Cambodian girl in that class and trust and know that the bond will work out